He was taken during a raid in the desolate waste beyond the Iron Wall. His village, a forgotten sprawl of dust-worn bricks and crumbling shrines, was razed by the men of the Sultan's Janissary Corps, a punishment for straying too far from the will of the divine sultanate. Several boys were taken from the smoking ruins, their limbs bound, their faces streaked with ash and tears. Among them was one who did not cry, did not tremble. While the others cowered beneath the gaze of the Janissaries, this boy stared back, silent, unblinking. Even as the flames devoured the remnants of his home, he showed no fear. His calm was noticed by the masked warriors. He was delivered unto the training grounds of the Janissary Corps. Here, he was taken by masked instructors who would oversee his training and indoctrination, as well as determine his worthiness of joining the Sultan's elite. His identity was stripped from him completely. His name and memories were deemed burdens to be burned away. In their place, he was taught to forget the very concept of self. The instructors drilled into him a single truth, that his purpose was not to exist for himself, but to serve. From this moment forward, he was a vessel for the Sultan's will. Pain was revelation, obedience was grace, and duty was the only truth that mattered. His youth was a litany of agony and discipline. Each day began before the call to prayer and ended long after nightfall, filled with brutal physical conditioning, forced marches, weapon drills, and endurance trials meant to grind away weakness. His body was hardened against cold, pain, hunger, and fear. The saints who trained him wore silver masks and never showed kindness, only commands and corrections. Just as relentless was the spiritual indoctrination. Scripture was recited and carved into his memory, and failure to recall a verse meant flogging or fasting. One surah at a time, the Sultan's will was drilled into his mind as thoroughly as his body was shaped for war. Throughout his training, he was regularly visited by the Sultan's Jabarian alchemists, robed mystics from the House of Wisdom, who brought with them pain and purpose. They performed rites that mingled the spiritual with the surgical, working their art upon his growing body. With heated needles, they inscribed commands and prayers into the nerves of his spine and arms, marking him, binding him to the will of the Sultan. They brewed potent elixirs, thick and bitter, that he was forced to swallow under supervision, concoctions that ignited his blood and rewrote his strength. Each dose left him writhing in fever, his muscles twitching, his bones aching with growth. As weeks passed, he grew faster, stronger, and more resilient than any natural man. Through whispered invocations and burning sigils etched into his flesh, they forged chains upon his soul, bindings no less real than shackles. His loyalty was not only taught, but etched into the very shape of his spirit. By 15, he could sprint barefoot across a mile of razor-sharp stone. By 18, he could field strip and reassemble his Jezzel blindfolded, while reciting the entire litany of scorn. By the time he came of age, his body had become a mass of hardened muscle, shaped by years of brutal conditioning and alchemical enhancement. Though he had yet to step onto a battlefield, his skin was already a canvas of scars, each one earned through relentless training and ritual indoctrination. When he was deemed ready to join the Janissary Corps, he was anointed in martyr's oil and presented with his war gear. He was given a set of alchemically treated iron war plate, etched with sacred scripture and sealed with ritual oils to resist blasphemous rot. A falcon-like helm was placed over his head, sleek, sharp, and watchful, its visor shaped to mirror the eye of the prophet. He was armed with a Jezzel rifle, long-barreled and inscribed with verses of judgment, and a yataghan blade with a red silk-wrapped hilt. Alongside these, he was given a set of talismans blessed by the House of Wisdom, spiritual bulwarks crafted to shield his soul against the whispering torments of hell. Now a full-blooded Janissary, he was sent to the Iron Wall, where he joined his brothers in an endless vigil, guarding the sacred domain of the Sultanate. For years he endured brutal campaigns against the forces of hell, stationed across the labyrinthine trenches that sprawled like veins beneath the wall's shadow. When the enemy advanced, he fought in brutal close-quarters combat, where blades flashed in darkness and blood soaked the soil. The violence was ceaseless, and he met it without hesitation, amassing a growing tally of kills. With each campaign, his warplate evolved. His armor, once plain, was reshaped by battle and ritual. The breastplate was reinforced, where parts had been ripped free in battle. He had it engraved with burning verses and laced in gold-threaded sutures. Each surviving charm that clinked along his belt was a testament to another war survived. A mantle of black hide, stripped from a beast hunted in the wastes, hung across his shoulders. Prayer beads made from same bone coiled at his neck. His yataghan blade had opened more heretic throats than he could count. Yet with each victory, he felt no personal pleasure, only the cold satisfaction of seeing the enemies of the Sultan fall beneath his blade. His pride was not in trophies. It beat, silent and constant, behind his ribs, a will that sought not glory, but eternal service. His unwavering resolve did not go unnoticed by those who watched from behind silver masks and within incense-filled halls. He was the only survivor of a doomed charge against a fortified heretic bunker, sprinting through a hail of gunfire as his brothers fell one by one. Reaching the enemy stronghold alone, he slaughtered every cultist inside with blade and fire, then stood amidst the corpses until reinforcements arrived. Another time, during a cold and silent watch, he discovered an infiltrator, a heretic assassin cloaked in shadow, creeping through a tunnel beneath the wall. They fought in pitch darkness, blades ringing in tight quarters. In the end, it was he who emerged, dragging the body of the would-be killer behind him like a hound returning with prey. During a prolonged siege, a junior officer's will faltered as the heretic horde surged forward. Without pause, he executed the man on the spot with a shot through the visor. Cowardice had no place in the Sultan's ranks. The line was held that day. Each act marked him, not with medals or titles, but with the quiet, watchful acknowledgement of his superiors and the whispered awe of his peers. He had become something more than just a Janissary. He had become a vessel of pure, unbending purpose. Now a veteran with a history of flawless service, he was summoned one evening to the sanctum beneath the eastern gate. The walls were dark with incense. The Sanjak Bey stood waiting, robed in white and gold. There the Sanjak Bey produced a scroll, wax-sealed with the symbol of the Sublime Gate. He had been chosen. He was Yüzbaşı now, captain, a commander of men, a blade with its own mind, and the war beyond the wall awaited his first command. He stood now not as a nameless blade among many, but as a captain of the Iron Sultanate, a paramount figure of divine purpose. His armor, once humble iron, had been reforged into a radiant ensemble of gilded scale, each plate kissed with sanctified oil and hammered flat by the master armorers of the Eastern Forge. The armor scales shimmered like hammered sunlight, layered atop heavy crimson under-robes, and belted by ritual cloths dyed in the blood of oath-breakers. His shoulders bore ornate pauldrons, chased in bronze, their ridges curved like the horns of the Sultan's sacred bulls. His helm was regal and predatory, sculpted into the likeness of a falcon with a high crest and plume, its twin eye slits narrow and mirrored. A cloak of coarse grail-spawn fur hung from his back, dragging across the ground like a martyr's shadow. His Jezeel rifle had been replaced with a great hafted variant, barrel etched with devotional oaths and counterbalanced by a brutal axe head affixed beneath the muzzle. A weapon meant as much for cleaving flesh as for delivering sanctified fire. At his hip rested a yataghan of immense size. The hilt was wrapped in dark red hide, taken from some beast slain beyond the wall. Charms and trophies dangled from his armor and weaponry, scrolls of scripture, feathers bound in waxen surah seals, the broken horn of a beast of the wastes, and brass tags inscribed with the names of enemy champions he had slain. At his command stood 20 Janissaries, silent, faceless killers in glimmering bronze scale. Their helmets bore crests like the wings of birds, and their movements were perfectly synchronized. Their presence like an extension of the Sultan's were made manifest. Upon his shoulder perched a taquin creature, a strange, harpy-like being the size of a child, with a woman's pale face, black pit eyes, and scaled legs ending in talons. Its wings shimmered bronze and rust red, but the greatest gift of all stood behind him, a brazen bull. Towering and broad, its mutated brass hide glistened with sacred oil and runes that pulsed with alchemical heat. Its left arm ended in a massive rotary cannon, eternally lit by the burning gullet within. Its helm, forged into the image of a wrathful bull, vented fire from its nostrils. When it moved, the earth trembled. It was not merely a weapon, but a miracle, proof that the Sultan's eyes were upon him, and that his faith had been judged absolute. Yet with elevation came expectation. His first charge as a Yüzbaşı captain was not a deployment, but a test, a mission decreed by the Sanjak Bey himself. The task was simple in its phrasing, brutal in its intent. Find an enemy of the Sultan and kill them. No unit, no guidance, no support. His proving would be written in blood. In preparation for his expedition, the newly minted captain travelled alone into the desolate wastes beyond the iron wall. There, upon a hill of ash and fractured stone, he lit a great fire and raised the banner of the Sultanate, a cloth of crimson and bronze stitched with verses of war. It was a call not to the Janissaries, but to the Azebs, the wild and volatile auxiliaries drawn from tribes, criminals, and wanderers too unruly to stand among the Sultan's elite. Within days, nearly 100 answered. They came on horseback and on foot, on rusted wheels and half-starved beasts. Some came armoured in scrap and bone, others shirtless and painted with ash. Their arms were mismatched, curved blades, Jezeel carbines, bomb spears, axes, and flintlock pistols. They wore lamella stitched together with wire and hide, surah-etched plates tied to their chests with leather cords. Some masked their faces in cloth, others exposed scarred, tattooed skin. They sang strange hymns and chanted tribal litanies as they approached the fire. Some came out of loyalty to the Sultan, eager to bleed for his glory. Others came to kill heretics, driven by hatred. Still more came for less noble reasons, to seize relics, to loot, or to carve names for themselves in blood and flame. He did not ask their reasons. He only demanded obedience. Service to the divine Sultan was all that mattered. As the Azebs sharpened blades and sang war songs, the captain dispatched his taquin creature into the blackened horizon. With wings like rusted bronze and eyes like pitch, it flew low and fast, hunting not for any target, but for a chosen prey. Long ago, during his years in the Janissary Corps, there had been a moment of great shame, a time when one of their own, a commanding officer, had betrayed the Sultanate. Seduced by the promises of power whispered by Hell's agents, the man had manufactured a blind spot along the trenches. He had abandoned his post, opening the way for a brutal heretic incursion. For 3 days and 3 nights, the Janissaries fought to reclaim what was lost. Hundreds of soldiers died, and dozens of Janissaries were martyred beneath the blood-slicked mud. When the trench line was finally retaken, only ruin remained, and the traitor's body was never found. He was declared him heretic, his name struck from all records, cursed to wander the wastes. But the captain had never forgotten, and now he would find him, and he would exact a blood price for his fallen brothers. He gathered his Janissaries, the Azeb horde, and the brazen bull beneath the burning sky. When the sandstorm rose from the waste like a curtain drawn by unseen hands, he gave the signal. Under its cover, the war host marched into the darkness, veiled in grit and divine wrath. Not a word was spoken. No banners flew. Only the storm bore witness to their passing. He would return with a traitor's head, or not at all. The war host pressed onward through the wastes, past the crumbling remnants of villages long claimed by the endless war. Time and erosion had buried their names, and the wind had erased their stories. Yet signs of ruin remained, shattered idols, sunken minarets, and bones half consumed by the sand. In one such village, they came upon a clearing at the heart of a sunken town. The streets were lined with cracked stone, and the buildings leaned like penitent men. In the center stood a scorched pillar, blackened by fire. Bound to it were the remains of a human skeleton, charred and fused with rusted chains. The bones were twisted in agony, and its mouth, jawbone fused open, was locked in an eternal scream. Around the pillar, strange sigils had been painted in dried blood and ash. Heretical script, blasphemies written in broken high surah, circled the base. A brazier, long cold, still stank faintly of brimstone. The captain approached in silence. The Tarquin creature hissed as it landed on his pauldron, its wings rustling with discomfort. Even the brazen bull released a low groan, steam venting from its flanks. A ritual had been performed here, one of offering, one of mockery. He said nothing to his men. He stepped forward, placed one armored hand on the scorched skull bound to the pillar, and crushed it in his fist. Bone crumbled like ash between his gauntleted fingers. Then he signaled them to cleanse the site with fire. As they departed the remains of the village, one of the Azeb scouts returned at a sprint, sweat and dust streaking his face. He knelt quickly and breathlessly reported approaching figures, armed, fast-moving, and closing from the east. The captain followed him to a rise overlooking the horizon. There, through the swirling sand, he saw them, a small war band moving like a pack of jackals across the dunes, clad in patchwork armor and bearing Azeb banners. But these were not his. They made a beeline toward the war host's position. His instincts warned him of danger as he watched the warband approach. Their tribal appearance was not unusual for Azebs, lamellar armor, crude weapons, jagged banners. But to a man, they were entirely concealed in ragged cloth and piecemeal armor, not a single face exposed to the storm. Their movements, while mostly natural, struck a dissonant chord in the Yüzbaşı's mind. Something was wrong. Then it struck him. There was no hesitance in their stride, no caution, no tribal boasting or challenge cries. They moved with purpose, but without the wary pauses of desert-born warriors. No scout checked their flanks, No rear guard watched their backs. They moved not as raiders, but as arrows already loosed. He narrowed his eyes behind his mirrored visor and signaled for his riflemen to take position. Whatever these men were, they approached not as friends. The encircling Azebs took their positions quickly, spreading out around the oncoming band. Yet the newcomers showed no sign of concern. They halted only when they were 20 meters from the war host. From among them, one figure stepped forward, likely their leader, draped in heavier cloth and adorned with tokens of unknown origin. The captain advanced to meet him, his grip firm on the haft of his jezail. His instinct screamed at him with every step. Something was deeply unnatural. The way they moved, the complete concealment of their forms, the eerie silence, all of it scraped against his battle-honed intuition. When he closed to 10 meters, his Taquin creature dove from the sky and landed sharply on his shoulder. Its lips parted in a hiss, and 2 words escaped it like venom. Black Grail. A heartbeat later it screeched and took to the air. The captain did not hesitate. He raised his rifle and fired point blank at the approaching figure. The shot struck true, but instead of falling, the figure burst apart in a cloud of writhing black flies. They surged outward like smoke given hunger, seeking the exposed flesh of the war host with shrill, unnatural buzzing. The air filled with their stinging bodies as they tore through the first rank of Azebs, burrowing beneath skin, crawling into mouths and eyes. The explosion of the figure's body whipped up the dust around them, and an unnatural wind howled through the ruins, transforming it into a full-blown sandstorm. Visibility vanished. Chaos followed. The Azebs panicked. Some screamed, others fired blindly into the storm, while a few dropped to the ground clawing at the insects boring into them. But the Janissaries did not falter. Their lines held. They raised their jezails and fired into the oncoming corrupted host with perfect formation. Bullets ripped through ragged flesh, but many of the false Azebs did not fall. They marched forward despite torn limbs and cratered chests, bloodless and relentless. The flies surged toward the Janissaries, but the blessed talismans upon their armor pulsed with radiant heat. As the vermin approached, they burst into embers or turned to ash, repelled by holy wards sewn into cloth and steel. The Janissaries stood untouched amid the madness, their armor glowing faintly as if suffused with divine fire. The captain chambered another round and stepped forward, calm as the eye of the storm. Instead of charging forward, the false Azebs turned their backs on the war host and began to converge on the scorched remains of their exploded leader. They dropped their weapons and tore the rags from their bodies, revealing plague-consumed flesh, skin blackened and cracked, muscles withered to cords, and sores that wept pus and smoke. With groans like the breaking of rotted timber, they hurled themselves onto the ashen gore where the swarm had first emerged. Their bodies began to melt, flesh bubbling and sloughing like wax. Limbs fused with limbs, faces pressed into each other, mouths widened into gaping maws. A mass began to form, a writhing, blasphemous amalgam of bodies, eyes, talons, and tongues. It pulsed and grew with unnatural speed, absorbing the plague-ridden corpses like mud claiming the drowned. The brazen bull let out a roar that rattled the stones beneath their feet. With a hiss of steam and the grind of gears, it raised its rotary cannon and unleashed a barrage into the growing horror. Blessed shells tore through the forming mass, ripping free chunks of liquefied limbs and pulped viscera. Yet the abomination only slowed, reforming just as quickly, the mouths within it now screaming in mockery of prayer. The nightmare was only beginning. As the abomination absorbed the last of the false Ezebs, it released a terrible scream, an unholy birth cry from too many mouths. The sound rattled through the storm, echoing across the dunes like a dirge for sanity. By now, the swarm of flies had dissipated, their purpose fulfilled, the damage was done. Nearly half of the Azebs in the captain's war host had been touched by the corruption of the Black Grail. Their bodies were failing, boils rupturing across their flesh, limbs stiffening with unnatural rigor, eyes sinking into skulls. Some wept, others howled. Most simply stared at their hands, as if realizing they were no longer their own. Then they turned. Corrupted Azebs raised their weapons and opened fire on their untainted kin. Jezzails barked, grenades detonated. Screams filled the storm once more as the war host turned upon itself. The untainted Azebs responded with fury and desperation. Blades met blades, gunfire tore through former comrades, and the sand ran red with fratricide. Some hesitated and died for it. Others fought with savage abandon. The bonds of brotherhood shattered beneath the weight of survival. The Janissaries remained unmoved. Their formation did not break. Their aim did not falter. They fired into the fray, cutting down those who had marched beside them with indifference, their talismans burning like lanterns in a plague-ridden night. The captain stood amidst the chaos, one eye on the abomination, the other on the unravelling of his war host. This was not merely a battle, it was a test, and failure would mean damnation. He barked out commands, his voice cutting through the storm like a scimitar. The Janissaries obeyed without hesitation. He ordered them to ignore the Azebs, both loyal and corrupted, and to focus all their fury on the abomination that now moved with unnatural grace toward their position. With perfect cohesion, the Janissaries split and encircled the creature. They brought forth hand mortars and launched volleys of explosive fire into the shifting mass. Blades were drawn, yataghans gleaming beneath flickering talismans. The explosives tore craters into its body, limbs flying, teeth shattered. But the monster was unbothered. With explosive speed it retaliated, tentacles of fused limbs and sinew lashing out. Some smashed Janissaries from their feet, their bodies hurled like dolls into the sand. Others were ensnared, dragged screaming toward its central mass of gnashing mouths and boiling eyes. Several of the tendrils lashed toward the captain himself. He met them with cold precision, his blade flashing in clean arcs. He cut them from the air with contempt, steam rising where ichor met alchemical steel. Still it came. The Janissaries responded with equal ferocity. With unwavering discipline, they fought through the storm of limbs and shrieking flesh, cutting free their entangled brethren and pressing inward. Their yataghans sang through the storm, hacking into the creature's bloated flanks. The captain surged forward, a blur of plated muscle and righteous fury. He raised his axe, anointed and etched with verses of war, and drove it deep into the side of the abomination. With a roar, he pulled the trigger embedded in its haft, and a blast of alchemical fire erupted from the blade's edge. Gore and ichor splattered in all directions, the monster shuddering in place. But it did not fall. Its strength, hell-spawned and unyielding, was terrible. One Janissary was caught mid-swing by a massive appendage with bone-shattering force, his armor crushed inward with a single blow. Another was seized and dragged toward the core of writhing mouths. He screamed until the end, his blade stabbing even as he was consumed. Still they held the line. Still they fought. With a roar that split the storm, the brazen bull surged forward. Steam vented from its joints, and its cannon opened fire with divine wrath, stitching a line of craters through the abomination's mass. Each impact sprayed chunks of corrupted flesh and shattered bone, causing the beast to reel and scream in agony. The ground shook as the abomination lunged with sudden, terrifying speed. It closed the distance in a heartbeat, tendrils exploding outward from its bulk like lashes. They wrapped around the bull's limbs and cannon, binding the mechanical beast in a web of thrashing limbs and tooth-lined cords. The bull howled in response, thrashing with monstrous force. It tore through many of the tendrils, steel hooves grinding bone and sinew to pulp. But the abomination's limbs regenerated as quickly as they were severed. Dozens more sprang forth, coiling around its legs, its cannon and limbs. The bull began to slow, buried beneath the weight of writhing flesh. This gave the Janissaries a precious respite. At the captain's command, they disengaged with disciplined precision and drew forth firebombs prepared by the alchemists of the House of Wisdom. Each device shimmered faintly with sacred glyphs, sealed in wax and iron. With righteous fury, they hurled the bombs into the abomination's mass. Glass shattered. Alchemical fire burst to life, cascading over the creature's body in waves of emerald and violet flame. The abomination screamed again, no longer a chorus of mockery, but a cry of genuine pain. Its limbs thrashed with desperate fever, tentacles flailing in a frenzy, striking stone, air, and flesh alike in chaotic arcs. Still, the Janissaries stood firm, forming a ring of fire around the beast, their mirrored masks glowing with reflected flame. The Janissaries poured gunfire into the abomination, desperate to destroy its ever-mutating flesh faster than it could regenerate. Jezzails barked in harmony, each blessed bullet striking with divine intent, chipping away at the shifting horror. As the abomination writhed in agony, the brazen bull bellowed once more and tore itself free with a surge of steam and rage. Metal groaned, and tendrils snapped as it pushed forward. With one final defiant roar, it drove its cannon directly into the creature's core and fired. The blast erupted from within the abomination, sending a shockwave of gore and ichor skyward. Fleshy limbs flew apart, and several maws detonated in wet bursts. The beast screamed, louder than before, as it began to unravel from the inside out. The battlefield fell into a momentary silence, broken only by the hiss of cooling metal and the labored breath of the living. Then, desperate gunfire rang out across the storm-scarred field. The uncorrupted Ozibs had triumphed. With bloodied hands and haunted eyes, they executed the last of their fallen kin, those corrupted by the black grail who still twitched and snarled upon the sand. Jezzails cracked, blades fell. The screams of the dying echoed through the storm as the final act of fratricide was carried out. In the aftermath, the captain stood silent amidst the scorched and bloodied ruin. He watched as the leader of the surviving Azebs approached. The tribal warrior moved slowly, his gait stiff from wounds, his face grim. As he neared, the captain found himself wondering what would be asked of him, what plea or protest the tribesmen might bring. Around them, the cost of victory was evident. Over half the Azebs were dead or maimed, their bodies sprawled among the dunes in twisted repose. 5 of his Janissaries lay motionless, talismans still glowing faintly against broken armor. The brazen bull stood smoking in place, its exposed hide a latticework of gashes, ichor slicked and steaming. The price of felling the abomination had been steep, not just in lives, but in resources. Bullets expended, rare alchemical devices from the House of Wisdom reduced to shattered glass and scorched earth. Even victory left scars. He wondered if the Azebs would seek to abandon the expedition now. The thought disgusted him, but he was no fool. He understood the difference in upbringing between the Sultan's elite and the wandering sons of the wastes. To his surprise, he saw no hesitation in the old Azeb's eyes as he drew near, only iron resolve. The warrior seemed unfazed by the attention of the imposing captain, which only deepened the captain's respect. He spat on the scorched ground and spoke in a low, guttural tone. "Will we kill the one behind the beast?" The captain gave a firm nod. "Then we stay," the Azeb said simply. A pause, then softer, as if carving the words from his own soul. "My son died in the fighting." Surprising even himself, the captain acted on impulse. Struck by a sudden, deep respect for the man who had suffered loss and still stood firm in service to the Sultan, he reached down and retrieved one of the yatagans, once carried by a fallen Janissary. He offered it to the old Azeb. The warrior stared for a long moment, lips trembling. Then, with shaking hands, he accepted the blade. Bitter tears welled in his eyes. He did not weep, but they fell regardless. To an Azeb, such a gift was no less than priceless. The weapon of a Janissary, a mark of trust, a mark of honor. He nodded once and stepped back in silence. Despite the inner pain, the old Azeb moved with fresh resolve as the war host gathered what strength remained and began their march. They departed the blood-soaked ruin to make camp on unsullied ground. As the campfires were lit and the wind whistled softly over bloodied steel, the captain once again surveyed his war host. He walked among them in silence, his mirrored helm catching the flicker of flames and the haunted eyes that surrounded them. The Azebs were weary. Those who still stood bore wounds, both fresh and festering. Bandages were bloodied, and prayers murmured with trembling breath. Some stared into the fire as if trying to burn away what they had seen. Even his Janissaries, forged for endless war, showed signs of wear. Their armor was dented and scarred. Talismans flickered with diminished light. A few bore new wounds wrapped in silence. The brazen bull stood watch over the perimeter, its exposed flesh a patchwork of burnt steel and leaking pipes, still exhaling steam like the breath of a wounded beast. He said nothing, but he saw everything, and he knew they could not endure another such trial. Their strength, their munitions, their faith, it was all thinning like blood in sand. So he resolved that tomorrow they would make way directly toward their prey. There would be no more diversions, no more delays. Either they would return with the traitor's head, or not at all. He stood on the ridge, silent and unblinking, his gaze fixed upon the village that sprawled like a wound in the earth below. This was the place, the refuge of the traitor. The thought of it made him want to spit on the ground in disgust. The traitor had not even made through the wastes. What had once been a simple settlement now reeked of corruption. It had become a haven of the Black Grail. Foul smoke billowed from warped chimneys, churning skyward in thick, unnatural plumes. The shapes of buildings sagged and slumped, rotted through and overtaken by fungus and ash. Crude symbols of heresy marked the ruined walls, some pulsing faintly with infernal energy even at a distance. Patrolling the shattered streets were Azebs in form only. Once tribesmen whose flesh was now pockmarked, stretched thin and desiccated from within. They moved in unnatural cadence, twitching and shuddering with each step, their weapons clutched in fingers too long, their eyes long emptied of soul. The captain stood still, watching, waiting. Nightfall would be his veil. But for now, he observed, cataloguing entry points, gauging enemy numbers, discerning ritual sites among the ruins. And as he watched, fury boiled within him, not for himself, not for the death to come, but for the Sultan. He remembered the traitor's betrayal like a blade to the gut, the screams of dying brothers, the stench of blood-soaked trenches breached by the legions of hell, the days of slaughter that followed, the endless tide of suffering bought by one man's treachery. And that man was down there now, beneath a blackened sky, hiding behind monsters and cults and filth. The captain shifted his gaze to the dunes surrounding the village. The rock and sand offered little cover, and yet, here and there, he caught glimpses of his Azeb warriors. They moved with a hunter's patience, low and deliberate, slowly spreading around the outskirts of the corrupted settlement. Their ability to vanish into the terrain was uncanny. As they found positions, some behind boulders, others within sunken crevices or under the shadow of broken outcroppings, they seemed to disappear entirely. It was only when they moved again that their forms revealed themselves, ghosts in the dusk, stalking the village with silent resolve. The trap was being laid, and night was nearly upon them. He descended the ridge, the bulk of the corrupted village hidden once more behind the curvature of rock and sand. His boots crunched softly against the gravel as he made his way down to where the Janissaries waited in disciplined silence. They stood in formation, unmoving, mirrors of his will. The captain did not waste words. He stood before them, axe in hand, his voice calm and iron-edged. The Sultan's will is spoken. The traitor waits below, cloaked in filth and falsehoods. We are his will. He looked across their ranks, at scorched armor and fresh bandages, at talismans that still flickered with holy light. Tonight, we extract a blood price for our fallen brothers. The Janissaries bowed their heads in silent accord. The captain turned his gaze once more to the darkening sky. Night had arrived. The Janissaries spread out into the night, forming a loose line across the darkened sands. They advanced with a steady, deliberate pace, each step measured, their mirrored helms catching what little moonlight filtered through the swirling dust. There was no attempt at stealth, no effort to muffle the clink of armor or the low creak of leather straps. Their presence was a statement, not a question. Behind them, the brazen bull emerged from a ravine of shadow like a beast birthed from the deep. Steam hissed from its joints. Its eyes, carved from red glass and backlit by sacred fire, glowed with violent purpose. It loosed a roar into the night, a sound that shattered silence and made the corrupted things within the village stir. The bull raised its massive arm. With a thunderclap, its cannon belched fire, hurling a shell toward the village. A heartbeat later, the village erupted. The shell landed near the central square, shattering a desecrated shrine and igniting the oil-soaked ruins. The explosion cast flickering orange light across sagging rooftops and shattered stone, and within that glow, shadows danced. Another shell followed, then another. Fires bloomed like flowers in the dark. Some of the tainted Azebs caught in the blast were torn to shreds. Flesh and bone disintegrated in the wake of the bull's wrath. But dozens more emerged from the ruined village, screaming oaths to blasphemous gods. They swarmed forward with unnatural speed, raising corrupted Jezils and hell-marked blades. Gunfire cracked. Dozens of tainted bullets pinged off the brazen bull's plated hide, while others found gaps in his armored shell, tearing through exposed flesh and alchemic tubing. Steam vented in erratic bursts as the war machine groaned in pain, but it continued forward. The Janissaries advanced alongside, unfazed. Each step brought them closer to the village, their formation tight, rifles raised. Muzzle flashes strobed in rhythm with the beating drums of war. They fired with precision, using the silhouettes cast by flame and shadow to pick out their targets. Though few in number, each of the shots felled a tainted tribesman. The storm intensified. Bullets and tracers streaked through the night, painting it in flashes of orange and red as yet more corrupted azebs poured from the village. Gunfire roared like thunder, and the Janissaries met it head-on. Bullets struck their armor, sparking off iron plate, forcing some to stumble under the sheer volume of fire. Their talismans flared with radiant heat, casting off waves of holy light as they burned away the corruption laced into the enemy's ammunition. Still they pressed on. Several fell, one with a round through the throat, where armor met collar. Another crumpled as shots pierced his side joints. But they did not break. The brazen bull drew the brunt of the assault. 100 cursed rounds battered its frame, shattering lenses and rupturing its steam lines. It roared again, louder, angrier. But then a streak of light cut through the darkness. A rocket. It struck squarely. The blast engulfed the bull in a wall of fire and smoke. The creature staggered, belching steam and flame as it fell to one knee. Then, with a final groan, it collapsed to its side, silent, still. Without the bull, the Janissaries would soon wither beneath the withering storm of fire. But the captain judged the moment had come. The trap had been set. Enough of the enemy had been drawn into the open. He raised a flare gun, aimed it skyward, and pulled the trigger. The flare hissed as it cut through the smoke-thick sky, blooming into a blinding white flower. The signal. From the dunes, the azebs of his war host sprang into motion. They had spent the day crawling, inch by inch, through the grit and shadow to close the distance unseen. Now they rose from their hiding places, Jezzails already raised. In a single breathless instant, they fired. Dozens of corrupted azebs fell where they stood, riddled with fire from their untainted kin. The second wave surged forward, blades drawn, war cries silent beneath the crackle of fire. They leapt into the fray, crashing into the tainted ranks like a tide of vengeance. Steel met rot, and the village was plunged into chaos. He broke into a run, boots thudding hard against the scorched earth, his Janissaries charging close behind. The village before them was a roiling pit of fire and fury. Flames leapt from shattered rooftops. Ash churned in the wind. And amidst it all, the azebs of his war host were locked in brutal melee with their corrupted kin. Blades clashing against bones, Jezzail barrels turned into cudgels as the close quarters robbed them of range. With a roar, the captain surged into the fray. He struck the nearest enemy with the full weight of his momentum, his axe cleaving through the twisted flesh of a corrupted tribesman. The thing screamed, then collapsed as the backhand of his gauntlet caved in what remained of its jaw. He moved like a storm through the chaos, weapon a blur, boots crushing the dying, fists breaking bone and limb. The Janissaries fanned out around him, each a living engine of war. Their Jaghathan blades cut through swarms of heretics, their armor spattered with blood and ichor. They moved with cold precision, unflinching, coordinated, divine in their brutality. Where they advanced, the enemy crumbled. The tainted azebs did not break. Whatever foul strength animated their corpses, it refused them the grace of retreat. They clawed, stabbed, bit, and screamed heretical curses even as their bodies were torn apart. For everyone that fell, 2 more seemed to emerge from the smoke-choked alleyways and half-collapsed buildings. A corrupted chieftain emerged from the flames, wielding a rusted halberd and howling praises to the Black Grail. He lunged at the captain, who sidestepped with practiced ease, catching the shaft beneath his arm and wrenching it away. A second later, the captain's axe was buried in the creature's chest. With a roar, he lifted the body overhead and hurled it into a burning wall. The flames claimed it in an instant. Azeb and Janissary fought side by side, the distinctions between them lost beneath the tide of battle. The air reeked of blood, smoke, and the sickly sweet taint of unclean sorcery. From somewhere near the center of the village, the ground rumbled, a deep-throated roar rising up through the corrupted soil. "Push forward," the captain bellowed. He charged again, cleaving his way through the line. Every blow he struck was a prayer in steel. Every enemy felled a tithe in blood. He fought as he had been made to fight, with total conviction, unshakable purpose, and holy wrath burning in his veins. The Janissaries drove deeper, hammering through the enemy ranks like a wedge of iron. Their talismans burned bright, repelling waves of corruption that clung to their limbs and armor. One was felled by a stray blade to the throat, another torn down beneath a pile of clawed heretics. But the line did not falter. Ahead, the corrupted village square came into view. The corrupted village square stretched before them, a blackened plaza paved in cracked stone and ash. The charred husks of saint statues stood as mockeries, their faces melted into grotesque parodies of reverence. At the square's edge, broken altars had been fused into a crude throne of filth and bone. But the throne was empty. The traitor was not there. Instead, they came. At first, they appeared as shadows moving through the smoke. But the smoke parted just enough for their forms to be seen. Towering figures in rusted armor, shaped like insect chitin and encrusted with layers of filth. Each wore a helm like a plated beak, the visage of a carrion feeder. Their armor hung with chains and flesh ribbons, dripping ichor and putrid oils. They wielded cruel polearms and halberds, weapons soaked in rot. Knights of the Fly. They moved with slow, deliberate grace, unbothered by the chaos around them. Where they passed, the corrupted Azebs fell to their knees, weeping black tears. A dread chill spread through the square. The captain's gut tightened. He raised his axe, signaling his Janissaries to form a wedge. The first of the knights struck like a thunderclap. It came in a blur of movement, faster than its size should allow. One of the Janissaries was impaled on a spear of rusted iron, lifted from the ground and hurled aside like a broken doll. Another knight followed, carving a swath through the Azebs with its halberd, sending heads and limbs spinning through the air. The Janissaries fought with unrelenting ferocity. They met the charge head-on, their blades clashing with the twisted halberds of the enemy. Talismans glowed, steel sang, sparks and blood flew. But the knights were monsters. Their blows shattered shields, crushed helms, and sundered armor. And worse than their strength was the corruption that spilled from them, a rot that crawled along blades and soaked into wounds. Even glancing strikes left blackened flesh and reeling men. The captain faced one of the beasts himself. It stood nearly a head taller than him, its armor slick with rot. The halberd in its hand dripped with diseased blood. As it lunged, he barely dodged the swing, its edge carving a gouge through the stone where his head had been. He answered with a sweeping strike, burying his axe into the knight's side. The weapon bit deep but did not slow the thing. It lashed out with a mailed fist, catching him in the chest and sending him flying. He crashed into a wall, iron plate dented, breath knocked from his lungs. He staggered to his feet, vision blurring, just in time to see the knight charging again. Then something passed in front of him. The old Azeb. The weathered warrior leapt into the path of the knight with no hesitation. He bore no shield, only the blade he had gifted him. With a defiant roar, he met the knight head-on. The halberd ran him through, but he did not stop. With the weapon still lodged in his gut, the old Azeb clutched the shaft, dragging himself up it, forcing his dying body closer to the knight's helm. He drove his blade into the gap beneath the chin with one final cry of defiance. The knight staggered. That was all the captain needed. He hurled himself forward, swinging his axe in a brutal arc. The weapon cleaved through neck and helm, decapitating the Knight of the Fly in a geyser of filth. Both the knight and the old Azeb collapsed. The captain knelt beside the dying man. The Azeb's blood was already soaking into the cracked stone. "You will carry his name," the Azeb rasped, voice shaking. "You will remember my son." The captain clasped his hand and nodded. "I swear it." Then the old warrior was gone. Around them, the battle still raged. The air was thick with smoke and rot, steel and screams. But the line held. The Janissaries fought with cold resolve. The Azebs, driven by vengeance and the memory of the fallen, answered with fury. The captain rose, his axe heavy in hand. The last of the Knights of the Fly fell beneath the combined blades of two Janissaries and a shrieking Azeb. Its helm split open with a wet crack as the captain's axe found its mark, and the creature slumped, convulsed once, then lay still. And with that, the battlefield fell silent. Smoke hung thick in the air, tinted orange by the creeping light of dawn. The sky, once blackened with ash and fire, now blushed with the pale glow of morning. The wind stirred gently through the ruined village, lifting the scent of charred flesh and rot into the chill air. They stood in the silence. Only 5 Janissaries remained. Each bore wounds, their armor cracked, talismans scorched and fluttering with fading power. Around them, the Azebs gathered, those few still breathing, panting with exhaustion, bloodied and hollow-eyed. Of the nearly 100 warriors who had answered the captain's call, fewer than 24 still stood. They had won, but it had cost them dearly. The captain stood amidst the corpses of the knights, his axe heavy with dried filth. He said no words. There were no words left. He simply turned, motioning for the survivors to follow as he advanced deeper into the village. They passed through narrow alleys and blackened doorways, stepping over the remains of heretics, beasts, and worse. The deeper they went, the more twisted the village became. Walls wept pus. Windows blinked like eyes. The very ground pulsed faintly with corruption. And then they reached it. A building stood at the heart of the village, or what had once been a building. Its shape was still vaguely that of a chapel, but all form and purpose had been consumed by the corruption of the Black Grail. Its walls were coated in slick, throbbing flesh. Tentacles of meat and bone hung from every window and door, twitching in silent rhythm. There were no visible entrances, only a dark mass of writhing limbs and living architecture. The captain felt bile rise in his throat. It wasn't just the corruption. It was the knowledge of what lay within. He stepped forward, eyes narrowing. The thing breathed. It inhaled, a deep shuddering suck of air through meat, and the tentacles quivered in response. He raised a hand to halt the others. They needed no explanation. They felt it too. The traitor was here. He approached slowly, weapon ready. As he neared, the mass shifted. Tentacles peeled back with wet, sucking sounds. A path formed, narrow, moist, lined with teeth and weeping sores. He stepped through. Inside, the air was thick with rot. The floor squelched beneath his boots. The light was dim and red, as though the sun itself refused to pierce this abomination. And at the center of the room, half fused with the flesh walls, was the traitor, or what remained of him. Once he had been a man, a captain of the Sultanate, proud and strong. Now he was a mass of meat and bone, bloated beyond recognition. Limbs jutted from unnatural places. His torso had split into a yawning maw that drooled black bile. Tentacles sprouted from his spine, writhing with spasmodic tremors. A single eye remained, human, wet, terrified. The captain stared in silence. This was the man who had betrayed the Sultanate, who had sacrificed his brothers, who had opened the gates for the heretics and watched as Janissaries died in fire and blood. For this, for a place among the damned. The captain stepped closer. The traitor twitched, a garbled moan escaping the wreckage of his throat. His mouth tried to form words, but only gurgling rot came forth. One malformed hand reached out, shaking. The captain struck it aside. "You are nothing." With slow, deliberate motion, the captain reached to his chest and tore one of his scorched talismans from its chain. Its etched surface still shimmered faintly with divine heat. The blessings of the House of Wisdom, not yet fully spent. He stepped closer to the trembling mass of meat and betrayal. The traitor's eye widened, sensing the judgment to come. It tried to pull back, but the flesh it was fused to only shuddered, locking him in place. The captain pressed the talisman to the exposed flesh. The reaction was instant. The runes seared into corrupted skin, smoke rising with the sound of sizzling fat and the stench of burning rot. The traitor's tentacles lashed and writhed, its singular eye bulging with unspeakable agony. A gurgled shriek poured from its warped throat, a sound neither human nor beast. He did not flinch. He pressed harder. The flesh beneath the talisman blackened, cracked, split open. Ichor burst from boils and seams. The body thrashed against the wall, tearing its own meat in a desperate bid for escape. But the captain remained, arm steady, gaze cold. "This is your reward." The traitor's limbs spasmed one final time. The eye rolled back, and slowly the thing sagged into stillness, burned from within. The captain dropped the smoking talisman to the floor, letting it hiss and sizzle in the ichor pooling at his feet. He gathered what remained of his war host and made for the iron wall, satisfied that the will of Sultan had been done here today.